Hello everyone, I'm excited to introduce you to one of the most exciting and insightful minds I've had the pleasure to know, Lee Smallwood. He possesses a unique ability to simplify even the most intricate concepts. Lee is, along with myself, the co-author of the course on emotionally intelligent negotiation. And he has a diverse background with experience spanning fintech and crypto startups to top Wall Street financial institutions. Whenever we delve into emotionally intelligent negotiation, I'm always fascinated by how Lee breaks down everything into its essence. Lee, it's an honor to welcome you to the table. Hello and welcome, Lee Smallwood. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Tony. How are you doing?
Yeah, really good. It's good to have you here, Lee. You and I have known each other for, like 3-4 years now?
Whenever COVID happened, you're my first memory from COVID, from
Yeah.
doing online learning, running into each other in the community, and just kind of going from there.
Yeah. All those years ago. So, Lee, let's kick off by you maybe just sharing with our listeners a little bit about who you are and what your interest in emotionally intelligent negotiation is.
Sure thing. So I'll give a very brief background. Most of my career has been in finance, broadly speaking. I started out as a financial markets trader. I then spent some time in the startup world and built a fintech company. Later had more of an executive role back in big finance. Most recently was part of a venture capital fund. So I've worked in a number of different aspects of, again, broadly finance and business. And so negotiation is an ever-present feature of that business. As a trader, you're negotiating the price at which you buy and sell things. As an entrepreneur, you're negotiating for things like raising venture capital or hiring employees. And of course, as a VC myself, negotiating deals to invest in companies. I think what I didn't appreciate for a very long time is I probably would have regarded myself as a good negotiator without any basis for saying that before learning more about negotiation and realizing that I actually wasn't a very good negotiator, and it was a skill set that I was eager to develop.
So what was that catalyst? Was there like a light bulb moment when you suddenly thought something happened, a deal went south? What was the light bulb moment?
It was really when I started to become interested in the literature. In the sale of my first company, I felt like I should do some research on what a good negotiation looked like. And so that led to one negotiation book, which led to reading more than 10. And through that had offshoots into psychology and persuasion and influence. And it just opened up this whole world of exploration of things that were happening sort of beneath the level of consciousness. And I realized that I'd been kind of operating on autopilot. I wouldn't say I was a terrible negotiator, but I certainly didn't have a well-defined skill set. It wasn't something I'd focused on or that I felt like I really understood. So it was really coming up to the sale of the company that forced my exploration into this space. And it was one of those things where you don't know what you don't know until you're exposed to it. So I think I went from unconsciously incompetent to consciously incompetent, and there begin the journey.
Well, I mean, let's give some full disclosure to our listeners here. Why don't you just tell the story of how we actually met?
Okay, so it's actually a nice segue from this story. So one of those very books was Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. I'm sure many of your listeners have heard of that. And I found that book to be very fascinating, a slightly different take on some of the other negotiation books that I'd read. But I found reading these books a little bit hard to translate into real life. And I found out that there was a masterclass, an online video course on Never Split the Difference and Chris Voss. So I took that course. It was finally great to see some of these principles put into practice. There was a lot that I really liked. There was a lot of stuff that I actually didn't agree with as much as well, which was interesting. But probably the best thing that happened is there was a forum and a community at the end of the course. And that's, of course, where you and I met. We created a spin-off group for people who wanted to practice negotiation and learn these tools and techniques and approaches. And that's where you and I connected. We built a community up to several hundred people, and eventually even from that community found that we had a different perspective, and since spun away and tried to refine everything that we learned into something that was more universally applicable to both different people in different situations. So that was the fateful moment where you and I first connected.
Yeah. And our listeners won't know that we worked together and created a full course. I think 3 years in the making, without actually meeting each other. And I remember when I first met you, when I flew over to Boston and then got the train up to New York. I was just shocked at how tall you were in real life.
It is funny on Zoom that to translate into real life. Height is something that doesn't really translate, but
Yeah,
likewise to you.
yeah. So, tell me about you've worked in fintech, you've worked in the startup world, you've worked in bank and Wall Street. I mean, you've really done the whole gamut. Tell me about how your negotiation style has adapted through the course of your career.
Sure. So I think earlier in my career, I either naturally or was trained to be more of what I would call a quote unquote hard negotiator. I think I had a good sense for having leverage and knowing when I was in a stronger position. And reflecting, I probably used those situations well in some cases and poorly in other cases. But I think one thing I was good at was holding a hard line when I felt like I had a position of what we might call strength. I think the evolution of my negotiation style, and much of it through the exploration that we had, was adding more of an EQ element, adding more nuance to a given situation, and actually realizing that, understanding leverage was only one very small part of a negotiation. And even when you understand that, that's not something you should always capitalize on. So I think I went from a very logical negotiator, very data heavy. I have a math background. I felt like presenting facts and figures was the way to make a strong case in a negotiation, which I think there is a time and a place for. But I think what I missed was the human element, really listening, understanding. And I think the switch flip for me was, to me, the golden ticket of negotiation is understanding what your counterpart's true motives are. And that's something I never really paid attention to earlier in my career. And later in my career, it became almost all that mattered. I feel like if I can really get to the bottom of what's driving the person that I'm working with or negotiating with, well, everything else is solvable. But that is the hardest piece of information to uncover and requires a very high level of EQ and emotional intelligence.
Yeah, for sure. And we've seen a lot of that. I mean, could you give us, Lee, some practical tips on how do you actually go about finding out what your counterpart truly cares about, why they've shown up for the negotiation?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, especially in the world that I work in, there is a temptation to do what I used to do, to try and present as having a strong position, to bring a lot of data and facts to the situation, and to want to get straight down to business. I think what I've found is actually taking the time not only to meet and get to know the person that you're dealing with, but what you and I call exploring the negotiation landscape should happen very early in the negotiation timeline. So, very open-ended, general, non-confrontational questions about who's involved in the situation, how the business or the person that you're dealing with is feeling, what are the sort of drivers to bringing them here, and really getting to that question. I think one nuance is asking directly, hey, why are you here, is not necessarily a good way to find out. It requires a little bit more massaging than that. But I think, some practical tips are definitely open-ended questions. So not boxing people into yes or no answers. Getting really comfortable with silence. That was another big area of development for me. I found it very, very difficult to sit in silence earlier in my career. But getting more comfortable with asking, these kind of open-ended questions, and then just sitting and letting people speak is a really effective way to uncover true motivations. You'll find that most people are uncomfortable not only with silence, but maybe they're thinking of that second or third thing to say, and literally, if you give them an extra 1 or 2 seconds, it will come out of their brain and out of their mouth. And I think that's one sort of more practical way of getting to the bottom of what brought people to the table.
I mean, you actually said just when we were off mic about one of the questions that you've asked. It's like literally 2 words, but you found it really powerful. Why don't you share some of that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. My current flavor of the month favorite question is simply, what else? And I find this to be such a powerful, innocuous question. I find it hard to imagine anyone being offended by this question. I also find that people rarely have expelled everything that's on their mind in the first go around. And it's an open-ended, friendly way of giving people a platform to keep speaking. You know, as humans, we tend to like the sound of our own voice. We tend to have a degree of what you and I, refer to as naive realism in the course. We believe that our view of the world is the absolute correct view, even though others may see the world differently. And we're eager to share that. And I think too often certainly in business, but also in our personal lives, we're quick to share our view and not quick to give other people the opportunity to share their perspective. And so, despite what's gone on before, despite what questions you've already asked, when the person that you're speaking with has finished speaking, simply asking, okay, great, what else? I found to be a really good way of really getting a little bit further down the rabbit hole and understanding people's true motivations, or simply uncovering more really useful, valuable information that can be really good inputs into getting to a really elegant negotiation outcome.
And I guess also it gives the other person space to maybe kind of work through their thoughts a little bit and listen to the sound of their own voice as they're putting their case across, right? So have there been any situations where people have literally talked themselves from one area to another just by you holding space and being silent and using that question?
I'm 100% confident that's the case. I'm struggling to think of an example on the spot, but certainly it's a fascinating experiment. I would definitely encourage all your listeners to try it, even with a family. How was your day? What did you get up to? And when they're finished speaking, what else? And you'll almost certainly find out something that you didn't know before the conversation that you otherwise wouldn't have known had you asked that question. But you're absolutely right. One of the other benefits I failed to mention is the processing. Sometimes people don't speak because they think you're going to speak, but sometimes they're literally still thinking and processing what their view of the situation is, or what their belief or what their stance is. So and that can change not only with additional inputs, but also just with having the time to think through and process everything that's going on in their mind. So definitely you can see people make 90-degree or even 180-degree turns just by giving them that platform.
How do you become a better listener in negotiations?
This is a really good question. My short and simple answer is practice. That may be obvious and not particularly practical, though. And so what I would say is, going back to my journey as a negotiator from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, is starting with conscious competence. And so one of the ways that I did this, and this is back in COVID where everything's on a Zoom call, is I literally had Post-it notes stuck on my laptop saying "listen" in permanent marker as a reminder. It's not something that we consciously do or consciously think to do. And so forcing ourselves to do it consciously first, having reminders on your phone, a couple of times a day, listen. That's how we do it consciously. And then over time, with more practice, it becomes more of an unconscious behavior. So that's what I recommend.
You've mentioned that the stages of learning there. Just in case there are some listeners, probably not, but you'd never know. There might be one or two people who don't understand or don't know what those 4 stages are. Could you share those with us, the 4 stages of learning?
For sure, absolutely, and we'll run it through clearly with my journey in negotiation as a concrete example. So with any brand new skill, we start with unconscious incompetence. And that simply means that we're not very good at something, and we don't even know that we're not very good at something. The next stage is conscious incompetence. And this will be triggered by an experience or a book or gaining of new knowledge. For me, it was reading a couple of negotiation books and realizing, oh my goodness, I'm doing this all wrong. I went from being bad and not knowing I was bad to being bad and now knowing I was bad. Okay, so what do we do about it? Well, we need to get good, and that's not going to be an automated process to start with. So through reading books, through doing online courses, through taking practice, through writing Post-it notes on your screen to remind you several times a day, we can become better. And that's a very, very conscious process. And so hopefully through that, I was becoming a better listener, asking better questions, having better negotiation outcomes, but it was a lot of cognitive effort. Now we're consciously competent. We're pretty good, and we know that we're pretty good. we're very thoughtful as we're doing it. And then the final stage is the more that we do that, it becomes unconscious. We become unconsciously competent, and that's the goal. That's the final stage. So very much like riding a bike or driving a car, something without even consciously thinking about. And in the case of negotiation, integrating it into our skill set and the way that we communicate with other people.
Awesome. And the problem that we face is a lot of people work really hard, don't they, to get to consciously competent and stop. Absolutely. And then they stop practicing, they stop doing the things that they did to get there, and they miss that final stage where they can be unconsciously competent. Where are you on that line at the moment?
In regard to negotiation, I think it's so multifaceted that I think aspects of the skill set I wish to develop are at an unconsciously competent stage. But many aspects are consciously competent and even consciously incompetent. You know, negotiation is too large and complex of a term to break down into a single skill. And I feel like it's a journey that never ends. Yeah. And you make a very good point. And many people will get to consciously competent and stop that journey. And the problem with that is that the skill does atrophy. If you then stop having your reminders, if you stop reading material, stop doing online courses, then you will forget, and you will move back. You can move back down the line as well as up. Yeah. And so, you know, it's one of those where practice is always important, and it's a never-ending journey to become better and more automatic.
Have you got any juicy stories of like when you were in maybe in the startup world of where you completely messed up on a negotiation?
I think one of the things that I took for granted. So I started my career in very, very large organizations, global brands, and I think I found them a little bit political and bureaucratic, as anyone who's worked in a large organization would realize. And that was part of the driving force to move into the startup world. And I think what I took for granted was the power of brand and of reputation and of global reach. And so when I started my company, I went from being able to get on the phone with any investor in the world pretty much to people having no idea who I was or what my company is. And believing that I had a great idea, I probably mispriced how valuable I could be and how valuable my company was and should be in the eyes of other people. And so the biggest mistake I made was overvaluing my company in the first stage. So raising venture funding for my first startup. I forget the specifics. I think we were trying to raise at a $5 million valuation in the very seed stage, and had one investor offer to give us a very large check, but at a $3 million valuation. And I thought I had more leverage than I did. And because I was still in that mindset, I didn't take the time to understand, hey, well, where did 3 come from? You obviously like our company, there's something interesting, but we're off on numbers. Can we explore that a little bit and understand their motivation for not only wanting to invest, but also for the discrepancy in valuation? Instead, I gave the hard charging, no, 5 is the best, believing that they would get there and believing that I had more leverage than I did. And, you know, that investor actually decided, okay, that doesn't work for us. Good luck. We'll cross paths in the future. That was early in the fundraising process. What I didn't know is that it would take me around another 100 meetings to raise that same $1 million. And so I cost myself a lot of time and effort that should have been spent on building the business, fundraising, because I didn't have the knowledge or the skill set to negotiate effectively at the beginning. So I don't know how juicy it is, but it is very profound for the growth of my company.
Yeah, that's really important, right? The idea mixed in. There's 2 things, right? There's the preparation and homework, which we know is the fundamental. You know, it's the step 1 in the negotiation timeline. But there's something else there that, and this is something in our conversations that came up probably about a couple of years ago, and I use it all the time. I use this line all the time, and where you said, most of the time we're in a negotiation and we don't actually know what we want. We just know we want more than is on the table. I mean, that was such a brilliant line. And I guess what you've just said is a bit of an example of that, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I should say as well, I think it's okay to want more, but to know why, and also that wanting a better price or cost reduction or discount or whatever it may be is only one part of a negotiation. And so that was my other critique of myself. It was very narrow. All I cared about was the dollar amount and the valuation, and therefore the dilution. And there was so much more we could have been talking about. This investor could have had introductions to me to a client that could have increased my revenue. They could have guaranteed my valuation in the next round. We could have done warrants and given them upside for free, but still had a line of credit to bring capital. And so I think through that statement that I made to you, I think we've evolved our thinking around what even constitutes a good negotiation, and that there are many more variables than just the single economic benefit, which, again, not to discount, is one part, but it is just one part of a negotiation.
Yeah, yeah. Has this made you, using emotionally intelligent negotiation, do you think it's made you a better person outside of the business world?
Oh, 100%. I think this has been a tremendous benefit in my personal relationships, my relationship with my family. I have a 2-year-old daughter, and being a parent was something that I was probably underprepared for. But I find trying to figure out what her motivations and needs and desires are a key to a happy life here. But yeah, I think it's for me, it's become way beyond negotiation. For me, it has become a part of a communication style and a way of interacting with other human beings. I think it leads to more genuine relationships. And, you know, there are benefits that are not, that don't have ulterior motives, or that was not the intent of the conversation. And this is my favorite, to live in a world where you're not always trying to negotiate or always looking for more, but you just become interested in other people and what their motivations are. And if you see ways to help them, being willing to do so, because it's fun and fulfilling to help other people on their journey. And so without being too philosophical, this has become a part of the way of life for me, and is beyond business negotiation at this point by such a long way.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're at that level where we both do martial arts. So you do jiu-jitsu. I've done karate for many years, and now in my older age, I'm more into kind of more relaxed, like Tai Chi. But I do remember my Tai Chi teacher saying to me that when you study Tai Chi, you don't do a grading in Tai Chi. Tai Chi is just a way of life. You know, it's just who you become. And when you and I have our discussions about your jiu-jitsu and my past martial arts, it's just who you are, right? You're always, I know how much you love your jiu-jitsu, and you're always reading books on jiu-jitsu, and so it indicates to you that it's actually a part of who you are. And I think when you get to a point where negotiation becomes that part of who you are, then you lose that desire to want to try and beat the other person, and you want to use that skill set for betterment.
I think that is 100% correct. And I would say there are a lot of analogies I find with jiu-jitsu, maybe because it's an obsession, but also in the journey as well. So if I think about learning jiu-jitsu, you start out by learning a series of techniques. This is an armbar. This is a kimura lock. This is a choke. And these are important to realize the mechanics of how jiu-jitsu works. But the more time you spend practicing, i.e. sparring and doing these, you realize they're all based on a finite number of principles of lever and fulcrum, of different joints of the body, of bodily mechanics. And so as you progress, you start to see, first of all, sparring slows down. It's almost like you see things in slow motion because you've done it so many times. But secondly, you're not looking necessarily for specific moves or techniques. You're looking for the principles that underlie those. If someone's body is out of sync, or if there can be more pressure on one side than the other, or if there is a carotid artery that can be closed off. But it is in many ways like our journey with negotiation. Yeah. And part of what I loved about our early process was learning these techniques from a variety of sources. And oh my goodness, these actually work. Yeah. At the same time, are we going to become a series of robots who regurgitate the same techniques over and over? Well, no, it's not actually the techniques. It's the principles behind the techniques. And so once you can abstract from the specifics into foundational principles, the principles we put together, well, then it becomes so much more natural, which again is in alignment with emotional intelligence and EQ. The more fake and false you feel like, the harder it's going to be to really build genuine relationships and rapport with people. But the more we can use the principles of what makes an effective negotiation the more natural we're going to be. And that's actually going to be an upward cycle as well that helps the negotiation and the conversation to progress.
There's a lot to chew on there. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm hearing here is the not the it's like the book Chop Wood Carry Water, right? It's not the end game, but it's who you're becoming as you are becoming intellectually curious about the whole process, right? And that's and the pockets of enlightenment that you get along the way.
Absolutely. And, you know, for your listeners, I'm happy to give a concrete example. I'm sure most of them will be familiar with Chris Voss and Never Split the Difference. We spoke about that already. And he has a technique where you would almost repeat back what someone would say and try and interpret their feelings. Sounds like you're having a good time, Tony, might be an example. Now, this is great if you've never done negotiation before. It's teaching you to throw the conversation back to the person, to give them a platform. That's a good thing. What's not good is getting into a conversation and saying 9 times in a row, sounds like we're on a podcast, sounds like we're having a great time, sounds like this podcast is still going. Right. That becomes robotic and unnatural and isn't going to help. But the principle of giving someone a platform to keep talking, very much like the question, what else, is what's valuable, not the manifestation of it and not trying to put it into a box. And so you're absolutely right. These techniques become principles, become a way of life. And I think that is the journey that we're all on, and is never ending as well, but is a really fulfilling one and really profound in the context of business negotiations, but also in the rest of our lives.
Awesome. So Lee, where can our listeners find you? How can they connect with you and dip into that Mekon-headed wealth of knowledge that you have?
Well, the number one thing I would say is obviously we have the emotional intelligence website and online course. I would definitely encourage people to check that out. We've distilled so much information, so many of these techniques into principles, into timelines, and there's more coming as well. So I think that's the best way to save the 3 or 4 years in the wilderness that you or I took, reading, writing, researching, distilling, recording, and really making succinct the key principles and foundations of emotionally intelligent negotiation, which I believe is a key to success and fulfillment, not only in business, but only in life. So I would most certainly direct people there.
Lee Smallwood, thank you for joining us at the table. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
As we wrap up today's enlightening discussion with Lee, I hope his insights into emotionally intelligent negotiation have resonated with many of you. If today's conversation struck a chord, subscribe, like, and share this episode with other people in your circle. Thank you again for joining us, and a special thanks to Lee. My name is Tony Anagol, and this is Empathy at the Table.